Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving right into a seriously fascinating crisis from human history, the collapse of the ancient Zhou dynasty in China, to uncover a social technology so profound, it completely reframes how we think about rules, society, and human behavior. You see, when the invisible, inherited order of the Zhou world suddenly broke down, it sparked this desperate race to figure out how to put society back together. And right at the center of that crisis was a thinker whose proposed solution is still, honestly, widely misunderstood today. So let's just start with a hook that gets right to the heart of our modern bias. Was Confucius literally just trying to boss people around with strict rules? I mean, if you took a casual history class, you might actually think Confucianism was nothing more than this rigid, conservative set of behavioral regulations. A strict code telling you exactly how to bow, what to wear, and how long to mourn your parents. But as Yuncheng Zhou's brilliantly analytical book draft argues, that assumption is just entirely wrong. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the massive gap between that myth and the actual structural reality. On one hand, we have what's called the regulatory misreading, the idea that Confucius wanted strict laws to just constrain human action from the outside. But on the other side, we see what Zhou calls the constitutive reality. Confucius wasn't trying to construct some new system of restrictive laws. He was trying to restore something that was broken, the genuine internal occupancy of inherited social roles. He wasn't building a prison. He was trying to restore a lost way of inhabiting the world. Section 1. Ritual as Social Technology. This brings us to the concept of li, which is usually translated as ritual. But li is absolutely not a code of law. It's the constitutive medium through which the inherited, unspoken rules of society are transmitted across generations. Think of it less like a speed limit sign telling you what not to do and more like a computer operating system. It's the underlying social technology that makes human coordination possible in the first place. Let's really hammer this home, because it's absolutely crucial. LID is a constitutive technology. To borrow an idea from the philosopher John Rawls, regulatory rules just constrain behavior, like saying, hey, don't drive over 65 miles per hour. But constitutive rules, they actually create the activity itself, like the rules of chess. Without the rules of chess, you aren't just playing chess badly, you're basically just playing with dolls. LID doesn't restrict behavior from the outside. It creates and defines the social roles themselves. It defines what it actually means to be a ruler, a parent, or a neighbor. Section 2. The inner achievement of Ren. So the crucial point is, ritual alone isn't enough. We need Ren, often translated as humaneness. Ren is the internal moral achievement that makes those inherited rules actually work. If Li is the external structure, Ren is the inner substance. They are basically two halves of the same coin. Without Ren, you might know exactly how to perform a ritual perfectly, but you're really just an actor on a stage. There's this absolutely fascinating exchange in the Analects between Confucius and his star student Yan Wei. The quote goes, "To master oneself and return to ritual is Ren." Notice how it's an action, right? It's an achievement. Yan Wei asks for specifics, and Confucius essentially tells him to align his entire being, his looking, his listening, his speaking, with ritual. It grounds this super high-level philosophy in tangible, moment-to-moment human effort. It's not something you just naturally have. It is something you actively achieve through practice. And this right here highlights the absolute core of Chapter 4's analysis. The central tension of the entire text is the contrast we're looking at right now. Genuine office holding versus theatrical performance. Genuine office holding is when someone fully internalizes the moral substance of their role. When they mourn, they actually feel the grief the ritual demands. On the flip side is theatrical performance, someone merely going through the motions to look good or gain status. For Confucius, the collapse of his society happened precisely because leaders had become highly skilled theatrical performers instead of genuine office holders. Section 3. The Classroom of Character. So if society completely relies on genuine internal virtue, how do you actually cultivate that? Well, the Confucian curriculum was incredibly specific, but it wasn't about memorizing a list of laws. It started with the family as the primary site of cultivation, learning basic respect and care at home. Then it moved to studying classical texts, not for historical facts, but to develop deep emotional sensibilities. And finally, observing a living, breathing teacher. Let's look a bit closer at how those texts were actually used. And this brilliantly illustrates how it all worked with the Book of Odes, or Shijing, which is a collection of ancient poetry. Students weren't reading it just to pass a multiple-choice history test. By studying the emotional responses of the ancients, their joy, their grief, their restraint, students were actively training their own emotional patterns. They were literally tuning their internal emotional instruments to the right frequencies. This builds into a really clear step-by-step transformation. First, you internalize the emotional truths of the text. That internalization transforms your inner character, and only then can you genuinely embody your social office, whether that's as a minister, a father, or a friend. You don't just know what the role requires, you have actually become the exact kind of person the role demands.
Section 4. The power of exemplarity.
So how does this highly cultivated individual virtue actually scale across a whole society? The mechanism is something called mimetic transmission. Basically, virtue spreads by observing exemplary teachers. Because these inherited unwritten rules had never actually been formalized into explicit laws, the only way to truly transmit them without distortion was through a living person. The exemplary teacher is the ultimate proof of concept. You learn how to inhabit a role by watching someone else masterfully inhabit theirs. But here's where we hit a massive structural vulnerability. Returning to the core dilemma of Chapter 4, what happens when virtue becomes a performance? If the whole system relies on identifying and mimicking exemplary people, what happens when someone realizes they can just fake the external behaviors? It's kind of like corporate virtue signaling on social media today. You get all the social rewards without doing any of the hard internal work.
Section 5. The paradox of articulation.
Okay, let's dive into this, because this is the absolute climax of Zhao's Chapter 4, the paradox of articulation. When the old, invisible, inherited rules of the Zhao dynasty started failing, Confucius had to explicitly articulate what those rules were in order to save them. He had to stand up and say, "This is what a good son looks like. This is what a good ruler does." But the very moment you explicitly articulate what a virtue looks like, you accidentally provide a step-by-step template for a bad actor to fake it. In the original functioning Zhou order, social coordination relied on tacit enactment. It was invisible, inherited, and largely genuine because it was literally all anyone knew. But to restore it, Confucius had to rely on explicit specification. He had to actually state the rules. And once they are stated, they are learnable. And once they are learnable, they are incredibly vulnerable to strategic, theatrical imitation. This is the tragic paradox of trying to save a tacit system. All right, let's quickly summarize our key takeaways from this explainer. First, Confucianism was a profound project of restoration, not the construction of a rigid regulatory police state. Second, we saw the beautiful, absolutely necessary interdependence of Li, the external technology of ritual, and Ren, the internal moral achievement. And finally, we uncovered the structural vulnerability of articulated rules, how writing down what makes someone good simultaneously teaches others exactly how to fake it. Understanding this ancient social technology totally changes how we look at our own modern institutions today. Which leaves us with one final, deeply provocative question. If the very act of writing down the rules allows people to fake them, how can any society, ancient or modern, ever truly guarantee genuine virtue in its leaders? It's a structural limit we are literally still battling to this day. Thanks so much for exploring this with me, and I'll see you in the next explainer.